welcome to our session on participation, hype or not. We have wonderful guests, starting with Tülin, Hadi, and Nico Carpentier from Charles University. And I would like to announce the mode of operation of this participatory session. There will be 6 questions, and after each question, we are going to give the opportunity to the audience to contribute to the dialogue. So please feel free and maybe force yourself a little bit out of your comfort zone to join in the discussion. And you don't always have to ask questions. You can also make comments. So we value your opinion. So the first theme about participation is equity, inclusion, and power dynamics. The first question is about in what ways is participation intertwined with power dynamics and societal struggles, and how can we circumvent tokenistic and manipulative approaches to participation and promote genuine inclusion. So, Tülin, Hadi, please.
Yeah, I'd like to begin with the first question. I've been involved in participatory processes as the head of the Citizens Council and as a citizen as well in the last 4 years. And I had the opportunity to develop a short answer, a simple answer for this question. In my opinion, me, you, and the audience here, people walking in the streets, and the decision makers, the kids in the school, etc. We are all living in the same society, and we are sharing the same space. And one of us is taking the responsibility of administrative duties. So. I don't think we have many big differences between all of us. Anyone who is strongly focused to the topics about providing quality services to the public, and who is willing providing quality spaces, then it's enough. Leaving aside the technical expertise, so anyone can take this responsibility, in my opinion. But I believe we cannot leave this responsibility of making the decisions for just one person on its own. And we should take also our responsibility via the participation. And also, I believe the participation is not about the politics, is about taking part, voicing its opinion, etc. It's also an education. And the educative part of the participation is very important for me. And with impartial information, the citizens can benefit about the educative part of the participation, and it can help to know each other and discuss some critical topics or difficult topics for politicians. For example, why not discussing the agreement of Istanbul, for example, or the channel of Istanbul? But after an educative part of the participation. This is my simple opinion for the first question. Thank you.
Thanks for your wonderful contributions. So what do you think, Nico, in this subject?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be with you guys. Maybe a quick disclaimer from my side. I wouldn't consider myself an expert in Istanbul's participatory urban planning processes. I might have something to say about participatory theory, and I'll be happy to share some thoughts, but I'm actually half accidentally here because I'm working on an exhibition which will open in the Energy Museum in a couple of days, which ends my commercial intervention, and now I can answer your question. I think that if we start thinking about participation, we should also immediately acknowledge that it's a political ideological concept. It's not politics in the strict sense. That's not what I'm saying. It's political. It is about power immediately, necessarily. And if we look at global debates about participation, because in every field, in every city, in every country, you will find discussions about participation. Every rock you turn, if you start looking carefully, you will find these discussions about participation. But there are also discussions about participation itself. What does it mean to participate? And to go to your question, what is meaningful participation? How can we avoid what is sometimes called manipulated participation? All that is an ongoing debate in all our societies. And if you start analyzing these debates, I would argue there are two main positions. One, which is not mine, I should be quick. One position that says, well, participation is taking part. And I've called that a more social approach because it's very much connected to what happens in social sciences. I would maybe slightly ironically say, if you go shopping, then you're participating in consumption culture. It's not my kind of participation, but it's actually the most pervasive use of participation we find. But then participation becomes the same as interaction. In that definition of participation, you're all participating because you're here, and that's enough. Because you're interacting with what we're saying, you're at least hopefully listening to what you're saying. That is called, in that approach, participation. That's a very broad definition of participation, which I think includes everything, which means nothing. The second approach is a more democratic theory, political studies approach, which says participation is about sharing power. And that's a very different definition of participation. And there's a huge struggle between these two approaches. Some people are saying, no, it's just if we ask people, it's fine. Others will say, no, it's about how you distribute power on particular decision areas, particular processes. It is who you involve, to go your question, who you include. And that is participation in a more true sense. Proponents of that approach would argue. And then participation is no longer the same as interaction. Participation becomes something else, something extra. Of course, you always have interaction in participatory processes, otherwise they wouldn't be participatory. But the extra element that defines participation in that approach is the idea that power is somehow decentralized. And now I won't talk forever, but one extra idea. To what degree you decentralize power is again part of that political process, because you have more minimalist approaches that say, well, we can maybe sort of decentralize power a bit and we can share power a bit, but in the end we will have to decide. And others would argue, no, you need to maximize that sharing. You need to have equal partners in the process to be labeling it participation. And then we go into what is not just an analytical discussion, but also a normative discussion. What kind of participation is good? What do we want? What participatory intensity, what degree of participation do we actually like? I can imagine that in particular contexts, that's a bad idea to maximize participation. For instance, if you talk to the military, they might say, well, asking all our soldiers whether we should have this kind of tactics or not might not be the best idea. And they would be right. But in other cases, we should argue for more maximalist versions. We should strive for these more intense versions of power sharing, knowing that no participatory process will ever be perfect. No participation will be total. There are always elements in a participatory process that disrupt it, that prevent this maximalist fantasy which it is, from actually taking shape. But so for me, to give a very short answer to your question, for me, the notion of participation is automatically linked with the notion of power, because it is defined as sharing power. So that's an automatic connection for me.
Yeah, great points, Nico. And talking about sharing power, we would like to now ask audience to maybe reflect on their own experiences, both in their practices, but also maybe civic experiences. Would you like to reflect on the relationship between equity, inclusion, and power dynamics in participation?
Hello. Maybe I don't have much experience, but I am an academic researching children's participation in urban planning. And I would love to hear your opinion in that matter, how power dynamics works, because even though we adults participate in workshops, in the ateliers that are invited by the municipality, but if we don't follow up, our ideas can go in black holes. But when we think about children, maybe they don't have the opportunity somehow, and they don't have the power to follow up. And it feels like, for me personally, based on the research that I have done, this is a big challenge for researchers, for urban planners or policymakers to follow up with it, because there are biases on children, because they don't have the competency to understand the technicality of urban planning or to understand what actually policymaker says. So I want to hear your opinion on that matter, actually. Thank you.
Well, if we are talking just about the urban planning, well, the technical issues, yes, they might be a little bit difficult to understand, but there are many questions about urban planning. But if we take the urban planning, of course, there might be other topics apart from the urban planning. There are, how to explain, I mean, the participation is a broad topic in itself, and it has some characteristics. So the facilitation, for example, in my opinion, what we are asking is about the facilitation. It's the most important part of the, or one of the most important parts of the participation, in my opinion, and helping the wording of what's happening within the process of participation is the job of facilitators, and the information part also, the educative part also are very important. So we should advance step by step and then complete the whole process. The uncompleted processes are, in my opinion, are the worst cases about participation. That's what I would tell about in the second question. This is what I can tell you briefly for the moment.
Well, if I may quickly answer, there are a couple of things. One of the most interesting, maybe more historical facts about participatory theory is that urban studies was very much at the cradle of the thinking through participatory processes, right? If you go back to Sherry Arenstein's Ladder of Participation article, which is exactly as old as I am, by the way, and I'm not that young, if you go back, you will see the same dilemmas, the same questions, but also the same frustrations as are often used by people that try to organize participatory processes. It is extremely difficult. It is time-consuming. It asks a lot of empathy, which we will come back to, because I think empathy is one of the driving forces here. It asks a lot of time, and it generates necessarily frustration. if you organize participatory processes, what is, I think, vital is to keep that idea in mind that it is about sharing power. Then you start deconstructing the process. You start to pull it apart, as you say, in little steps. And in each of these steps, you ask, how can we involve people in a way that they understand the process? How can we make them more literate? How can we then empower them to actually be part of that process? And that's easier said than done. I know that I'm talking from a very luxurious position in being very prescriptive. This is how you do it. But having organized these processes myself, I know very well that there's endless frustration, because making things clear in a way that everybody is on board, which is a vital starting point, is extremely difficult. It takes a lot of time. And the pragmatics of participatory processes are often that there is not that much time. There is always time pressure, especially in urban planning. You have sort of a time scale that you have to respect. But what I think I'm always suggesting, don't be perfect. Try to be as good as possible in organizing participatory processes. You'll never get them perfect. But if you get them close to perfect, if you get them in a way, if you get them organized in a way that people actually are empowered to speak, to interact, and then have a degree of decision-making power, then you have achieved a lot. And I know that with children, you go into wonderful dynamics which are actually typical for each target group, is that you have to also understand their dynamics. A learning process with children, depending on the age, is also incredibly complicated and challenging, but also extremely rewarding. But there are also methodologies for doing that, for teaching and for translating knowledge to a level that children can actually interact with. So there are methods for doing that. But I think my main answer would be, let's be patient. Let's not try and create a perfect participatory process, because it doesn't exist. But we can get close. If that answers the question half.
So talking about time, I think we need to switch to the next question. So there are also questions coming from the audience. Maybe for the following section, I can follow up from here, I think so.
For the manipulative part, may I?
Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Opinion. Well, a couple of days ago, a friend of mine, an architect, told me, I'm against participation. I said, why? He said, this is always manipulative. I tried to defend the participatory processes, but he was really ready to reject whatever I would say. So he was right at the point and wrong at the same time. He was right because his experience was based only bad experiences. And he was wrong because he never thought about good quality participation. Why there is participation? What are the benefits of the participation? And what would be the way of proper participation? So, as you said, there is no perfect participation, but we can get closer to it. I think the framing of the topic, beginning from or the scale. Let's consider the scale, for example. The scale, the framing of the topic, lack of time, lack of money, lack of budget, and inclusivity, uncompleted processes. These are all the reasons why we don't experience almost perfect participation. So once we are getting closer to the quality of these elements, then we are closer to the good participation.
Yes, very well said. And from the audience, we have an interesting comment here. Gözde Atalay says, there are a lot of obstacles to experiencing participation practices at the local level. When we say participation to citizens, they think asking for something from the municipality as demanding something from the municipality. However, Gözde thinks that participation is when citizens want something on behalf of society. So how can we, as researchers and practitioners, motivate citizens to give their opinions for the benefit of society on this issue? So this is a very important question, so I'm going to develop a little bit more on this, if you don't mind.
My answer will be simple again. We had some experiences, less experience, but I think important. Many times citizens are coming, for example, we have the Istanbul Citizens Council with many ideas in their mind, or they are expressing their needs or their complaints. Then they stay at that point. Then some other people are coming with an action plan under their hand. So it makes the difference. Complaining about anything and voicing a need in the city is something, but bringing an idea on the table and asking the decision makers, the experts, the academics, the other citizens is something else, and thinking all together. We had a really important experience in urban farming land, a historical heritage site in Istanbul, in Piyale Pasha. So there is a debate going for a long time, one in Yenikule and the other one in Piyale Pasha. And the defenders are the same in both sides. So in Yedikule, the responsible department was different from the other one in the municipality. And then I went and asked for the one in Yedikule. They were not seeming very willing to discuss this topic, but for the other part, the agricultural services and the parks and recreation was responsible for the place. And then first, we gathered around the table. First, they discussed for a while because the story was long, and you did that, you said so, etc. Then after a certain moment, we started to think all together. And we went on the site. We saw everything on the site. We defined the problems there. And then we wrote a management plan, co-management plan for the site. So we thought once more what means the inclusivity in such a place, because what was thinking the municipality, dividing this, the plot into many pieces. So as many pieces as possible was meaning the more inclusivity, because as much citizens as possible would be benefiting of land. But the defender group said, this is not the inclusivity, so you can include the kids here. You can spare some part of the place. It was a 6,000 square meters land, so you can spare 4,000 of this for the gardener and 2,000 square meters for the citizens, and then you can protect the quality of the agriculture there. The historians, the academics, those who need access to cheap products, they can benefit from the land. And at the end of these discussions, the municipality said, if you weren't involved in that process, we will never be able to obtain such a result. It's been a success story, and I think this is the best example I can give about the benefits of the participation and the how to advance in a participatory process. The action plan is also needed.
Great. I think the discussion becomes more interesting when we have our examples from our own practice or research. Nico, you have anything to add?
Well, there are a couple of things. And to go back to the question or the comment you read aloud, I think one of the important things to emphasize, and that might not be the most popular position, but one important thing to emphasize is that there is always, on the one hand, a tension between, on the one hand, general interest, and on the other, private interest. And we sometimes see citizens as necessarily translating general interest, and politicians necessarily translating private interest. And I think it's a bit more complicated than that. One really important element there is that we need to acknowledge that also citizens are very diverse. And the story, the anecdote that you gave us is actually a really nice illustration of the fact that we need to bring all these different stakeholders, as they're sometimes called, people, as I prefer to call them, we need to bring them together and have them negotiate and agree so that that pluralism of society is protected. And in that sense, general interest is not necessarily served automatically by a participatory process. It is something that needs to come out of that process. It comes out of a negotiation where all these different voices work together, speak together, think together, and where they also respect each other's private interest. One of the phenomena that I think is important to keep in mind is the famous NIMBY, not in my backyard, which is very much about private interest. And sometimes we need to acknowledge that there are sensitivities, that there is a backyard there that people want to protect. But at the same time, we need to confront that particular interest with ideas about general interest. And you do that through negotiation, by confrontation, by putting these together. And all the processes I've seen that are more intense and maximalist participatory processes, they actually bring out that negotiation and that diversity where people tell each other, well, but that's what you see, but I see it like this. And in a good participatory process, there is a drive towards some consensus that respects all these different positions and that doesn't impose one. And I think that was what the question is. If you have one particular position that is imposed, often by more powerful actors, then you lose that diversity, you lose that negotiation, you lose that pluralism and diversity. And that is what participation tries to prevent. And that's why it's so important, because it brings out a diversity of positions and interests, and it tries to reconcile them. It does not impose a particular way of thinking. And in many cases, imposing one particular model is very destructive because it makes people unhappy. And if we want to talk about the relevance of participation, well, I think it generates social happiness. And I think that is a key element in this discussion. Right? It is clumsy, it takes time, it is very inefficient at moments. But in the end, on the long term, it generates social happiness. And that's why it's so important.
Yeah, thanks, Nico. I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I would like to also bring out this interesting points you brought out, the balance between the individual and the commons, the common good, and how to balance this in an age where hyper-individualism is becoming more mainstream, especially in Western world, we see it more. So I think from your own practices, you already start answering this question. So I would like to go to the next question. Participation actually operates based on the premise or a hypothesis that it leads to better practices. It leads to better sustainable urban development. For instance, do we have any evidence existing regarding the effectiveness of participation in the urban context? Especially, I think I'll start this with Tülin Hadi because she's already on the field.
I already voiced my evidence. I think this heritage site, which is used for the urban farming, was a very good example. We had some other experiences also, but not that strong to mention here. So this urban farming experience was my evidence.
Well, I think that if you talk about effectiveness, you also have to sort of ask the question, well, what's the measuring stick? Right? What kind of effectiveness you're looking at? If it's about making quick decisions, then participation is obviously ineffective. It takes time. So if you need an urgent decision, then a participatory process can be very destructive. The point is, though, that you don't often need urgent decisions. You often have time. And we should more take time, which is a discussion about slowing down society, which is another debate, but an important debate. So if we look at where participation plays a positive role, and again, I think we should be careful not to start blindly celebrating it. We should always stay critical, always look at appropriateness and objectives. But in many cases, I think when we do have the possibility of organizing these processes, we see that on the one hand, on the long term, it offers protection. It offers protection against one person making decisions on everything for a long period, one institution making decisions on the same thing. And we see that in urban planning, that unfortunately there's been this concentration of power, which in the end, on the long term, has disastrous consequences for the people living in these areas. I think that's one element. The other, you already mentioned, the educational component. Actually bringing in participation has the advantage that we teach people about participation. And it allows people to get more sensitive towards each other's positions, needs, interests, dreams. So that educational component is also quite important, and there is quite a lot of evidence that allows us to think about participation as being beneficial in that sense. There also, this is maybe my favorite, you'll have to forgive me for using psychoanalysis for a second, and going into the fantasies of participation. I think, well, you might know that Nietzsche wrote about the will to power in a very negative way, by the way, which I don't share. But I think deep inside all of us, there is a need to be listened to. There is a need to be heard. There's a need to speak. There's a need to at least be empowered. What a lot of more top-down decision models create is frustration of that desire, that pleasure that we derive from participation. And I think that actually is quite important. At the same time, there is also in society a drive to be heard. The popularity of social media, by the way, is a really nice illustration of that drive to communicate. Maybe not always in the most efficient and pleasant ways, but that's another discussion. That drive is there. What top-down processes do is frustrate society. They curtail this enormous reservoir of knowledge, but also that desire to be heard. They limit the right to communicate, the right to participate. And that is actually quite damaging. Now, societies have managed to control that process quite well. People know how to handle that frustration. If you look at the participatory process that goes wrong, then you have people sort of shrugging and saying, well, that's how it goes. That's what power does. And we accept quite a lot. But at the same time, it just adds scratches to our soul. Every time this little frustration actually disconnects us from the social. And I think that kind of damage on the long term is something that we should also take into consideration. So often, if you look at a very short term, very particular process, participation is inefficient. But if you look a bit in a broader sense, it becomes a very important force for societal improvement.
Thanks. So, from the audience, I'm asking you, do you have any evidence from your own practice saying that, well, I organized this in a participatory way, and I think the result is more sustainable, it's better quality, or what was your measuring stick for this? What were the qualitative criteria you used? Anyone wants to share their thoughts? Yes. Microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for the panel. So I think there is a lack, especially in Turkey, in like these kind of participatory processes by community-led participatory processes. Usually the processes are led by the local governments or led by the some other organizations or like the planning or architects. I think these participatory processes should be more community-led, which is also what I usually do. And also the local governments or the planners usually also they ignore the wisdom of the communities and the power of the neighborhoods, the local neighborhoods. And also the other thing, which they also ignore other practices usually. This is like a very maybe critic about the architecture and the urban planning. They don't work well with other professions. For me, for example, I'm a facilitator. I do facilitate like these kind of practices where I try to engage people, communities, underrepresented groups or like communities. So I think we should also empower the like the wisdom of the facilitation as a practice and also the art of hosting. So this also affects the power dynamics, especially because I can't easily say that the planners, the local governments or the architects doesn't know how to engage people in the processes. Usually because they have the power. So they need external practitioners like facilitators or like hosts to nurture and to facilitate the processes. Because I think the participation is not only about the question who, it's also about the question how we engage and interact with the people and the communities. So I also have some questions, if you allow. So my questions are like, how can we reset the purpose of the participation so that it can empower the people, the local people and the neighborhoods, and support the democracy? Because the participation is all about the just. We talk about inclusion, diversity, and equity, and they all come from a just orient. And the second question is, how can we transform participation into something more agile, just, and evidence-centric? Thank you.
Thanks, great questions, and this is the dialogue that we are searching for. So, Tülin, would you like to respond?
Yeah, could you please repeat the first question because I missed the first part of it.
How can we reset the purpose of participation so that it can empower the people, the local people, the communities and the neighborhoods, and also support the democracy? Well,
in my opinion, we should review the tools we are using. The problem is about the tools. Although we had many bad experiences about participation, and each participation, like Nico said, leaving scratches on the soul, getting disappointed. Once you are getting disappointed, then for the second time you are less willing, and the third time you don't want, and the fourth time you don't participate anymore. So we should review all the tools we are using. I don't think we deeply know all the tools which are suitable for participation. The scale matters. For which topic, which participation tool to use. I don't think we have enough knowledge about all these tools we can use, and their methods, of course. This is also another question. We should think about that thoroughly, and the steps of the participation. And about the facilitation, I totally agree with you. The facilitator is a very important part of the participation. It's not only about giving floor to the one who will speak or to just moderate the discussion. This is about helping people to support the wording, to give the to bring the joy to the atmosphere, to the meeting place, and then to help people to working as a translator. So I think this is very, very important.
Nico, I think you mentioned the ladder of participation, and I think the question is saying, how can we really put it all the way to the highest rung?
For those who are not afraid of heights. I think your question is a tactical question, right? How to do this. And in most of these tactical issues, I can be very Gramscian. So you have to forgive me for going back to some of the strategies that Antonio Gramsci basically developed. I think that if you want to create this upward spiral of more maximalist forms of participation, you need alliances. You need to actually use the practice of creating participatory processes in these more maximalist versions and collaborate with other actors that are willing to join in that particular objective. Because you can run into the wall of trying to convince everybody. It's not going to work. What you need to do is to create models, methods, tools, contexts that are driven by, at first, small groups that are willing to organize these more intense, more maximalist participatory practices. These alliances create social change. Social change, and I'm not talking about revolutionary change, I'm talking about slow processes that slowly, with all the frustrations that are part of that process, that slowly change societies, turn them into more participatory societies at all levels, right? At the very grassroots levels. And what we see in practice that a lot of these change processes are actually these alliances are coming out of maybe the less formal structures. But at the same time, institutions can play a role because institutions are not homogeneous. And to give you one example, also because you wanted to have some anecdotes, and I will happily, I'll take you to one example from the BBC, right, the British Broadcasting Company, which is a huge mastodon of an organization, but they had a very small unit which was called the Community Programs Unit in the 1970s. And that group were very much driven by participatory agendas. And the entire BBC hated them, right? Because they were doing all the things wrong, according to mainstream journalism, for instance. They didn't want to be purely objective. They wanted, as a unit, they wanted to give voice to the people through media. And that group managed to do wonderful projects for 20 years, and they still play, although they were disbanded in the early 2000s, they actually managed to set the agenda. And a lot of more alternative participatory media projects were actually connected to that set of ideas that they created. So even within really big institutions, you can find elements, units, components that are potentially part of that alliance for more maximalist participation. So it's a very political answer. It's about creating alliances with different actors that are willing to propagate more maximalist and perform more maximalist versions of participation.
And then there was a second question about maybe curating the results of the participation to be more democratic or something, right? You know, that was like a little bit more the agency of participation. I think a question of how can participation be leading to more democratic spaces or democratic results?
Well, I think that in democratic theory, there's actually a huge debate also in minimalist, maximalist terms. And what you often see is people that say, no, politics is just for the political system. Well, people like me say like, yeah, but the political is everywhere. And the political should be everywhere. Which means, for me, the participatory should be everywhere. Now, I don't know how many of you have children. Forgive me for making a bit of a jump. But the breakfast table, right? When you as a parent negotiate with your child what to eat, how to eat, when to eat, what not to eat, that's political. And that can be democratic. That can be more participatory. That can also be very authoritarian. And that setting, this is not my example, by the way. Anthony Giddens wrote a wonderful book on the intimacy of democracy, arguing that family is one of these key locations where we learn, to go back to that educational moment, where we learn about democracy. And I think that if we start equating the political and politics, we lose that critical perspective on thinking about all these different parts of society, all these different ways of interacting, all these different structures as also potentially participatory, potentially democratic. I think that democratic change comes out of this lower level of almost like a virus, like infesting all these different fields with participatory democratic ideas. And I think that is how democracy is truly created.
I did like this breakfast example a lot because I always use a similar example while talking about participation. I'm telling, aren't you asking your kids what to eat, they want to eat? This is like that.
Exactly. All right. Thank you for these nice comments. And the third element is, again, coming to maybe relating to your question again and the discussion we have. What kind of policy frameworks support the effective implementation of participation? And how can institutions be encouraged or incentivized to adopt participation practices? So you are actually very much working on this topic. Would you like to respond?
Well, in the last 4 years, IMM Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality they are expressing their intention about participation in everything about each implementation. So there is no discussion about participation in their mind. But coming to the implementation, it's not that easy. And we have some legislative frameworks, as you know. Each municipality has to have a citizens' council, and it's binding. No, it's not binding, but they have to have a citizens' council. And this is the only mechanism, governance mechanism between the municipality, the local authorities, and the citizens. So we are trying to operate this mechanism for the last 4 years, and although the institution has been founded upon the call of the mayor, it hasn't been that easy because participation is mutual. It needs mutuality. So the citizens are very enthusiastic, they are really interested, and they are, as you said, they need to be to express themselves and to express their opinions, etc. But when you have nobody around the table from the municipality, so it's for nothing. It becomes an ordinary neighborhood forum. So we need this mutuality. This is the most important thing, I think, which is lacking. So at the beginning we were telling, okay, this is the beginning, so they will get used to it. And that example of urban farming, I think this is the best one, who is proving that when everybody is around the table, it's possible to make a change. But if one is lacking, then we are failing. So the idea and the intention of the local government is very important. The decisions is very important. And to encourage them, I think there are duties also for the municipality, for the local decision makers. I'm talking in local scale, but also it could be in national scale also. But since our experience is in local scale, I'm talking about the local authorities. one part is the decision makers, and the other part is the civil society. The civil society has to grow, to mature, because this participation is not something like, okay, we want to participate, okay, we are very pro for participation, so let's get around the table, then it's done. It's not that easy. So one part is decision makers, the other one is the citizens, the civil society, and then both parts has to get matured about the topic. And as I said before, having an action plan is really, really important. Not only the complaints and the ideas, but how to implement them. Where is the partnership? Where is the characteristics of the topic? Because most of the time, the people of the municipality, they are also aware of the problem, but they don't know how to implement it. This is the problem.
Yeah, that's a very good addition. I want to quote Ranulph Glanville, famous cybernetician in this subject. He say, if you search for problems, then you'll find problems.
Yeah.
So that's actually what is the goal of participation and action plan, and to enable reflexivity and reciprocity in the feedback cycle is, I think, core to participation. And what's your addition, Nico, on this?
Well, in the discussion on legal frameworks, I think they are quite often necessary conditions, but insufficient. You need a baseline, which is legislation and regulation, otherwise it will never happen. And there are good ways of implementing them on the more long term, otherwise sometimes we have progress and then forget. And if there's no regulation, it's not hard-coded into society. But at the same time, it's insufficient because we also need a cultural change. We need different perspectives on, for instance, on leadership. And one example, it's a very long story, but we have a huge clock here that is ticking. You can't see that, but we can. One example from my hometown, from Antwerp, which has quite a substantial river, the Scheldt. And for some very particular reason, which I will not go into, the Antwerp citizens dislike bridges. We can have a very long talk about the psychoanalysis of the Antwerp people, but they totally do not want a bridge. At some point, the political system, so the city council decided that we should have a bridge. To be clear, not crossing the river, but crossing some docks in the harbor. And then we had one of the aldermen, the one responsible for the harbor, that said, well, I'm the alderman, I will decide. I will say we will have a bridge. Civil society then went, no, you will not decide, because the resistance from these Antwerp citizens was quite strong, quite remarkable, and for those who can now visit Antwerp, there is no bridge. The fact that an alderman said, I'm an alderman, and I will decide that there will be a bridge, is both problematic and naive. He was naive because it didn't work. The resistance was quite considerable, and he had to back off. But it was also problematic because it had a leadership culture that was completely insensitive to a way of thinking in that city, which was shared by most of the citizens. They just don't want a bridge. And that kind of sensitivity you cannot hard code into law. That is something that both citizens and politicians, people in leadership positions in general, need to be aware of and need to learn. And that's, again, the educational part of participatory processes. We still have a lot of educating to do. Not just creating a dichotomy between politicians and citizens, but acknowledging that we all have to learn how to be more participatory.
Yeah, the red lights are...
Before wrapping up, I would like to bring in one comment from the audience, Gözde again. Gözde Atalay is saying that she established a digital participation platform in Kırşehir municipality in Central Anatolia and asked citizens to vote for projects. But unfortunately, there was not very good participation, and people are afraid to share their personal information, opinions, especially uneducated and older people. So this also comes to your point about being education, and I think maybe Gözde is also answering her question in this way, that we need, besides facilitate participation, we need to establish a culture, from what I understand from what you say, and also the civil society needs to be ready for it, and people, the culture needs to be participatory as well, I believe. Do you want to add anything to this?
Well, just very quickly, without being very negative about online digital platforms, I think we also need to look at integrated participatory platforms that are offline and online. So putting all the money on the online participatory tools as ultimate solutions in many cases doesn't work, it backfires. You need to have, I think, more lengthy processes that involve people both face-to-face and in different capacities. The online can be a wonderful support, but we have to use it wisely, and that's another educational process that we have to go through, is to learn to use the digital in more responsible and effective ways.
Exactly. I invite you to discuss this topic in the break, and this comes to the end of our session, where we have a wrap-up question, maybe 2 sentences on, do you think the emphasis on participation justified or overhyped? Tülin.
Well, we can't blame a process being, I mean, if it's operated in a bad manner, so we can't blame the participation. So what we need is the, I think Nico said, the good culture of participation. We need the culture of participation, or the intention of the decision makers, or the behavior of the citizens are not wrong. We can't blame these two, but in my opinion, participation is not justified yet, but we can say it is overhyped also.
All right, Nico, what is your comment?
Well, I never respect dichotomy, so I will actually suggest a third option. I think it's underhyped, and I think we need to do a lot more work to achieve that participatory culture that we want.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, Tülin, Hadi, and Nico Carpentier would like to thank you for participating into this session, and let's continue the discussion outside there. Thank you very much for joining us.